Reverend Francis Lejeune. Not very many can say they know his name or any of his accomplishments. He's not mentioned often in the context of American history or for his work with the slaves of America. If he is mentioned, it's only a paragraph or two. Why is that? Lejeune worked with Negro and Indian slaves in South Carolina, working through sickness and famine to get them saved. This seems like a fairly noteworthy accomplishment, so let's look at what he did and why he should be remembered for it. Francis Lejeune was born in Angers, France, around 1665. He was raised in a Huguenot family and quickly took to the English Church. He graduated with a master's and a doctorate degree from Trinity College in Dublin. Later, he received ordination at the Church of England in London and served as a canon there until 1700, when he left to be a missionary in Antigua. He then received a royal provision on November 27, 1705, that would pay for travel expenses to Carolina. On October 18, 1706, he arrived in Goose Creek, South Carolina, which is where he would then spend the rest of his life teaching and ministering. There, he took notice of how the Negro and Indian slaves had not been taught the gospel, and this grieved him, and he made it his mission to save as many of the slaves as he could. Lejeune was full of optimism when he first arrived in Goose Creek. Most other people in his position would not have had such a positive outlook on things. Most people in his position were more concerned with how many people they could save in how much time, rather than growing with their community and followers. Later, he started to have a more realistic outlook on his situation and how to handle it, but I believe there is something to be said for looking on the bright side, even in the tough times. Overall, he was more interested in the Indian people rather than the Negroes. However, he was welcoming of both equally. He saw the Indians as patient and content, and thought that the Carolinians could even learn something from them. He was also intrigued with their culture and tried to learn as much from them as they learned from him. This also helped him get a foot in the door with the Indians and preaching his religion to them. Lejeune would often find similarities between the Indian beliefs and his own. At one point, Lejeune found evidence that the Indians may have circumcised their males from a young age, similar to the Anglicans. The Indians also held the belief that man was created before woman, and that woman was created out of man. Lejeune would compare this to the story of Adam and Eve from the Bible, often when talking to them. His opinions on slavery itself seem a bit blurry. While he expressed resentment towards the enslavement of Indians, he also owned 3 slaves himself. This makes it difficult to gauge what his exact beliefs on slavery as a whole were, but this didn't stop him from trying to save as many of them as he could. Many of the slaves he taught to actually asked to be baptized. He was more than willing to baptize these slaves if their masters consented to them doing so. However, this was another problem that Lejeune ran into. Most of the slave masters either didn't care about their slaves' salvation or went against it entirely. Lejeune was not only saddened by the slave masters' negative opinions towards slaves' salvation, but also that they didn't care in general. Many slave masters viewed their slaves as nothing more than beasts, and Lejeune took offense to this. Lejeune also was grieved by the slaves' sexual immorality. Slaves didn't seem to have wives, they simply had children with various women at various times. While Lejeune did have a problem with this, he seemed to place most of the blame on the slave masters rather than on the slaves, scolding the slave masters for allowing immorality to take place and run rampant. Later on, he would allow slaves to be baptized without their master's consent if he knew them well enough and knew their intentions were right. He also made a rule that if a slave was baptized, they must stay with one woman or get permission from the slave master in order to separate from her. Near the end of his life, Francis Lejeune was offered a position at St. Philip's Church in Charlestown, a few miles away from Goose Creek. However, he died before he was able to accept it. He passed away from malaria and lost the use of his limbs and couldn't talk for the final couple months of his life. While there is some gray area to his story, mostly because he isn't a very well-known figure, I believe that he had good intentions and tried his best to act on them. Throughout his career, he always tried to stay optimistic. I believe this is something everyone could and should learn from. One of the biggest lessons to be learned is with his work with the Indians. His interest in their culture no doubt made them interested in his own. People don't want to hear what you have to say if you're not interested in what they have to say as well. When it comes to how many slaves he led to salvation, it's a bit unclear. However, it is known that this number wasn't terribly big. and I believe this is another reason why he is not well remembered. Most famous priests or religious figures are known for saving and converting thousands of people. However, with Leja, he didn't convert a large number of people or start this big movement, but what he did do was take the time to know the people and build relationships with them. This is something that most religious organizations, and even just regular organizations, have lost sight of. And this is what I believe makes Reverend Francis Leja someone to remember and even to look up to.